January 1943. The black waters of the Solomon Islands glisten under a half-moon, broken only by the faint silhouettes of Japanese supply convoys slicing through the night. The air is thick with the smell of salt, diesel, and the quiet tension of men who know that death could come in an instant. On the decks of tiny wooden PT boats, young American sailors huddle behind the steering wheels, their faces pale under the dim glow of lanterns, eyes fixed on the distant shadows. Each engine hums with nervous energy, a whisper of speed and steel barely contained within fragile wooden hulls. Across the water, Japanese commanders, confident in the impenetrability of their cruisers and destroyers, laugh quietly, dismissing these toys as a threat. Yet within these slender vessels, armed with torpedoes and a determination born of desperation, a storm is quietly gathering. Every splash of water against the hull, every shiver of the wind, carries the weight of history. Tonight, the underestimated will strike, and the giants of the Pacific will learn the peril of underestimating what looks fragile. From this moment, the night itself holds its breath, awaiting the coming clash that will echo across the war. The daring of these wooden ships would soon carve a legend in the dark waters of the Pacific, setting the stage for a confrontation that neither side could have predicted. The Pacific War in early 1942 had left the United States reeling. The attack on Pearl Harbor had crippled the battleships of the Pacific Fleet, and Japanese forces had swept across Southeast Asia with alarming speed, securing resource-rich islands and establishing a seemingly unshakable perimeter. Every month, American commanders watched as Japanese convoys, laden with troops, supplies, and equipment, moved through the archipelagos, supporting garrisons that threatened to choke the Allied advance. Conventional naval battleships and cruisers were scarce, their losses at Pearl Harbor still fresh in memory. Out of necessity, the U.S. Navy turned to smaller, faster craft to disrupt enemy supply lines. The patrol torpedo boat. These PT boats were an unlikely weapon. Built from wood, with engines that shrieked like banshees across the water, they were fragile, cramped, and barely armored. Yet in their speed and maneuverability lay a deadly potential. At only 80 feet in length, a single PT boat could outpace much larger vessels, strike under cover of darkness, and vanish before the enemy could mount an effective counterattack. Early prototypes had faced skepticism from naval brass. How could wooden hulls, no thicker than a dining table, challenge the steel giants of the Imperial Japanese Navy? But desperation breeds innovation, and these small crafts became the foundation for a new kind of naval warfare, one where stealth, surprise, and human courage mattered more than raw firepower. Training was intense, brutal, and merciless. Crews learned to operate in pitch-black nights, navigating treacherous reefs, dodging enemy searchlights, and handling torpedoes that were as unpredictable as they were lethal. Every man on board understood that one miscalculation could mean death, swallowed by the Pacific before dawn. Yet, amid the fear, camaraderie flourished. Sailors shared whispered jokes, small rituals, and unspoken bonds forged in the crucible of uncertainty. Each mission carried the tension of a high-stakes gamble, but also the thrill of being part of something revolutionary, a new method of war that could tip the scales in favor of the Americans. Meanwhile, Japanese commanders continued to underestimate the threat. Their focus remained on large-scale engagements, counting on the superiority of their cruisers, destroyers, and heavily armed convoys. Nighttime raids by small American boats seemed insignificant, mere irritations on the edges of a massive operational network. They saw the PT boats as fragile, expendable playthings, unworthy of serious attention. In reality, the Pacific's maze of islands and narrow straits created ideal conditions for these wooden predators, allowing them to strike where the enemy least expected and then vanish into the shadows. The early months of 1942 offered a grim school for American forces. Guadalcanal and the Solomon Islands became testing grounds for this unconventional approach. Reports trickled in. Convoys disrupted, supplies lost, enemy morale shaken. The war in the Pacific was no longer only about capital ships dueling across open seas. It had become a war of ingenuity, audacity, and nerve. Wooden boats, once dismissed as toys, were proving their worth in the dark. Each mission revealed not just the vulnerability of the Japanese supply lines, but the potential for a small, determined force to challenge the overwhelming strength of an empire. The stage was set. The PT boats were ready, their crews trained in shadows and fear. Japanese commanders laughed at the thought of these wooden vessels threatening their convoys. Yet in the looming nights ahead, those smiles would fade. The tension between expectation and reality hung over the Pacific like a storm cloud, waiting to break. By mid-1942, the Japanese had solidified control over much of the Pacific, their convoys moving with the confidence of invincibility. Troop transports and supply ships traversed narrow straits under the escort of destroyers, cruisers, and occasionally battleships. Each convoy was a floating fortress, bristling with guns and vigilance. To Japanese commanders, the vast size and firepower of their convoys made them virtually untouchable, especially to small wooden boats. Intelligence reports occasionally mentioned enemy activity, but nothing suggested that these tiny craft could threaten heavily armed vessels. The scale of their oversight would soon prove catastrophic. Meanwhile, the U.S. Navy continued to refine the PT boat strategy. Commanders recognized that conventional engagement with larger vessels was suicidal. Success depended entirely on stealth, speed, and the element of surprise. The boats would operate under cover of darkness, navigating the perilous island chains and coral reefs of the Solomons. They relied heavily on intelligence, scouting reports, and local knowledge from coast watchers and allied forces on the islands. Every ambush was carefully plotted, timed to exploit the enemy's blind spots. These tiny vessels, often carrying just a half-dozen sailors, became ghosts of the Pacific nights, striking swiftly and disappearing before the enemy could respond. Japanese naval doctrine, by contrast, emphasized brute strength and centralized command. Convoys followed predictable patterns, often hugging coastlines to avoid detection by submarines or aircraft. Anti-submarine measures were prioritized, but the threat posed by fast surface craft was underestimated. PT boats could dart in and out of range of the destroyer's guns, launch torpedoes, and retreat into darkness, an unorthodox tactic that exploited gaps in Japanese defensive thinking. Early encounters demonstrated the devastating effect of such attacks. Supply losses mounted, Japanese confidence faltered, and commanders began to realize, albeit too slowly, that their largest ships were vulnerable in ways they had never imagined. The human dimension of the PT boat campaign cannot be overstated. Crews were young, often barely trained beyond the basics of navigation and gunnery. Yet the sense of purpose and audacity drove them into perilous waters night after night. Fear was constant, yet controlled. The threat of sudden death sharpened instincts, honed teamwork, and forged an unspoken bond among sailors. Each mission demanded precise coordination. One wrong turn could mean collision with reefs, detection by enemy lookouts, or catastrophic failure of torpedo attacks. Even under the harshest conditions, crews learned to trust their instincts, the rhythm of the engines, and one another in ways that larger naval formations could never replicate. As PT boat operations increased, the Japanese began to sense a new kind of menace emerging. Convoy commanders noticed missing supplies, unexplained sinkings, and reports of small, agile vessels vanishing into the night after brief encounters. Panic was slow to spread, but when it did, it was subtle and corrosive. Erosion of confidence in what had once been considered invulnerable. For the Americans, every successful raid reinforced the doctrine that small craft, properly employed, could exact disproportionate damage against a superior enemy. These encounters laid the foundation for a psychological war as much as a tactical one. The Japanese had not faced a threat that operated entirely in shadows, defying expectations of conventional naval combat. By the close of 1942, the Pacific had become a theater of contrasts. Massive, heavily armed Japanese convoys clashing against swift, nearly invisible American PT boats. Each side pursued vastly different strategies, grounded in contrasting assumptions about technology, risk, and the nature of naval warfare. The coming months would see these assumptions tested, shattered, and rewritten. The stage was now fully set for a confrontation that would redefine the balance of power in the Solomons and illuminate the deadly potential of what the Japanese had once dismissed as wooden toys. The human element of PT boat operations defined both their triumphs and their tragedies. Crews were young, often in their late teens or early 20s, plucked from training camps and thrust into the unforgiving waters of the Pacific. Fatigue, fear, and the constant risk of death became companions. Sailors spent long hours hunched over wooden decks, listening to the mechanical heartbeat of their engines, scanning black water for enemy silhouettes, and waiting for the moment to strike. There was no armor to shield them, no luxury of distance. Every mission demanded courage beyond the ordinary. Yet, amid the terror, bonds formed that transcended rank. A shared glance could communicate life or death decisions, and every successful attack reinforced their reliance on one another. The PT boat became more than a vessel. It became a symbol of trust, audacity, and the human spirit under fire. Tactically, PT boats were an anomaly. Their advantage lay not in brute force, but in speed, stealth, and flexibility. Moving under the cover of darkness, they exploited the narrow passages and shallow waters of the Solomon Islands, using moonlight and shadows to approach unsuspecting convoys. Attacks were swift and surgical. A torpedo launched from 50 yards, a rapid machine gun volley to suppress enemy gunners, and then a retreat before destroyers could mount an effective counterattack. Coordination with intelligence sources was essential. Observers on nearby islands, Allied aircraft, and reconnaissance missions provided critical information about convoy movements. The successful synchronization of these elements turned each PT boat raid into a miniature symphony of precision and daring. Technological innovation made the PT boats uniquely suited for this war. Powered by powerful Packard engines, they could reach speeds of over 40 knots, faster than many Japanese destroyers could safely maneuver in tight straits. Their armament was modest but lethal. Torpedoes capable of sinking much larger vessels, twin .50 caliber machine guns for suppressive fire, and occasionally depth charges for anti-submarine operations. Radar, though primitive by later standards, allowed crews to detect enemy ships beyond visual range, giving them the advantage of surprise. Even the seemingly fragile wooden hulls contributed to stealth, minimizing detection in moonlit waters. The combination of speed, firepower, and invisibility created a deadly paradox. The Japanese saw toys, but in reality, these boats carried the lethal precision of a scalpel against an unsuspecting armada. The human courage, tactical innovation, and technological edge of PT boats coalesced into a force that defied expectations. Night after night, these small crafts slipped into enemy-controlled waters, challenging the preconceptions of Japanese commanders and reshaping the nature of naval engagements in the Pacific. The stage was set for confrontations that would test not only equipment and strategy, but the very limits of human endurance and audacity. Leadership decisions on both sides shaped the unfolding struggle in profound ways. On the American side, commanders like Lieutenant John D. Bulkley and Lieutenant Richard E. O'Kane understood the limitations of their vessels and the importance of audacity. They encouraged initiative among crews, trusting young sailors to make split-second decisions under fire. This decentralized approach contrasted sharply with the rigid hierarchy of Japanese convoy command, allowing PT boats to exploit fleeting opportunities with agility and precision. Every maneuver, every ambush plan, reflected not only strategic insight, but also an intimate understanding of the human factor. The fears, instincts, and resolve of men operating at the edge of survival. The Japanese, meanwhile, suffered from overconfidence. Their commanders relied heavily on the assumed invulnerability of large warships and well-armed convoys. Intelligence reports of minor disturbances by small craft were often dismissed as inconsequential. This hubris, coupled with predictable convoy routes, created vulnerabilities that the Americans were quick to exploit. Japanese destroyers, designed for fleet engagements and anti-submarine patrols, were ill-prepared for rapid, nighttime torpedo attacks from highly maneuverable PT boats. Their mistakes were compounded by slow communication channels and a failure to anticipate unconventional tactics, turning confidence into a blind spot that would cost them dearly. The enemy perspective reveals a combination of frustration, disbelief, and growing paranoia. Japanese sailors and commanders had to reconcile the humiliation of losing valuable supplies and ships to vessels that seemed fragile and primitive. Reports of PT boat attacks sparked both operational and psychological repercussions. Night watches grew tense, convoy formations became more rigid, and defensive measures increased. But often too little, too late. The realization that wooden boats could inflict significant damage unsettled even seasoned officers, eroding the perceived invincibility of the Imperial Navy and forcing a recalibration of strategy that came at a high cost. Finally, the moral and psychological dimension of PT boat warfare cannot be overstated. For American crews, each successful raid was a validation of courage and ingenuity, a proof that determination and skill could overcome size and firepower. For the Japanese, the attacks planted seeds of doubt and fear, demonstrating that no convoy was truly safe and that overconfidence could be lethal. In the dim glow of night operations, the war became a test not only of technology and tactics, but of nerve, resilience, and the human capacity to innovate under pressure. These psychological ripples would resonate far beyond individual skirmishes, influencing decisions, morale, and the very conduct of naval engagements across the Pacific. October 1942. The waters around the Solomon Islands were alive with movement, yet the night air was eerily quiet. Japanese convoys, laden with troops, ammunition, and supplies for the embattled garrisons on Guadalcanal, glided along predictable routes under the escort of destroyers. The men aboard these ships remained confident, their laughter echoing across the decks, dismissing rumors of small American wooden boats as nothing more than fanciful tales. Meanwhile, hidden in the shadows, the PT boats waited, engines idling softly, their crew's eyes scanning the darkness, hearts pounding in anticipation of the moment when stealth would become fury. At precisely 23:15, a patrol of 3 PT boats, led by Lieutenant John D. Bulkley, slipped through the shallow channels undetected. The first torpedo sliced through the water, striking the Japanese transport Nami, igniting a fire that illuminated the night like a flare. Machine guns erupted from the PT boats, suppressing the nearby destroyers, while another torpedo found its mark on the supply ship Shinko Maru. Chaos erupted aboard the Japanese vessels. Lookouts screamed, fire alarms rang, and the enormous ships that once seemed invulnerable were now vulnerable, burning and sinking under the relentless precision of craft that seemed to defy logic. The engagement lasted mere minutes, but felt like an eternity for those involved. PT boats danced between the shadows, darting in close to ensure hits, then retreating before the destroyers could mount an effective counterattack. Each attack was coordinated with near-mathematical precision, relying on timing, speed, and intimate knowledge of enemy movements. Sailors on the PT boats moved as if part of a single organism, responding instinctively to orders, signals, and the flow of the battle. Fires raged on Japanese transports, torpedoes streaked through water, and the psychological shock rippled across the remaining convoy. The empire that had dismissed these wooden vessels was confronted with an unforgiving reality. Size and firepower alone could not guarantee survival. The impact of this night would resonate far beyond the immediate losses. Japanese supply lines were disrupted, delaying reinforcements and forcing strategic recalculations. American crews, exhilarated but exhausted, returned to base with tales of daring and success that would inspire others. These encounters became a blueprint for future PT boat operations. Rapid strikes, calculated risks, and the exploitation of overconfidence. The decisive lesson was clear. Innovation and audacity could overturn assumptions, and even the mightiest fleets could be humbled by small, determined forces in the right hands. This confrontation marked the beginning of a campaign that would test every facet of naval warfare in the Solomons, setting the stage for continued encounters where courage, cunning, and technology converged to reshape the balance of power. November 1942. The Solomon nights grew darker, the sea colder. Yet the rhythm of PT boat operations had become relentless. Reports of previous successes had emboldened commanders to plan increasingly audacious strikes. Lieutenant Richard E. O'Kane led a flotilla into Kula Gulf, targeting a convoy carrying critical reinforcements to Japanese forces on New Georgia. Japanese destroyers, expecting only occasional harassment, were ill-prepared for the speed, precision, and coordination of the American attack. At 2:47, the first torpedoes were launched. The destroyer Niizuki, flagship of the convoy escort, was struck amidships, flames erupting along its deck and illuminating the surrounding water. The PT boats weaved through the chaos, firing machine guns to suppress enemy gunners while retreating and re-engaging from different angles. The Americans' wooden vessels seemed almost untouchable, skimming across the surface as if guided by instinct. Meanwhile, Japanese sailors struggled to regain order, struggling to bring firepower to bear on targets that vanished into shadows almost as soon as they appeared. The confusion and fear were palpable. The night had transformed into a deadly chessboard where speed and daring outmatched raw force. Over the next several hours, the Americans struck multiple transports and smaller escort ships. Fires spread rapidly, torpedoes found their marks, and Japanese losses mounted. The psychological toll was as significant as the material destruction. Officers questioned the reliability of their formations, crews feared night watches, and the assumption that Japanese convoys were untouchable was shattered. For the Americans, each engagement reinforced doctrine and morale. Small, fast boats, expertly handled, could dictate the tempo of night operations. By dawn, the PT boats had withdrawn with minimal damage, leaving behind a trail of sinking ships and stunned Japanese personnel. This turning point solidified the PT boat's reputation as more than an auxiliary force. It became a strategic disruptor. Japanese commanders were forced to adapt, reroute supply lines, and assign additional resources to convoy protection. Yet these measures could never fully negate the advantages of stealth, surprise, and audacity inherent to the American boats. The campaign underscored a central truth of naval warfare. Vulnerability is not measured in size or armament alone, but in awareness, adaptability, and the human courage to exploit opportunity. The clash in the Solomons would leave an indelible mark, demonstrating that even the most underestimated weapon could alter the course of a campaign and challenge the assumptions of a proud naval empire. The immediate consequences of the PT boat raids were profound. Japanese supply lines, once thought secure, were thrown into disarray. Transports sank, munitions were lost, and reinforcements failed to reach critical garrisons on Guadalcanal and surrounding islands. Commanders scrambled to reroute convoys, often through longer, more treacherous passages that slowed delivery and increased vulnerability to Allied air and naval attacks. The psychological effect on Japanese crews was equally severe. Sailors who had once trusted the invulnerability of their ships now faced the unnerving reality that small wooden vessels, no larger than a house, could strike with lethal precision and vanish before retaliation. Confidence waned, and the aura of invincibility that had defined the Imperial Navy in the Pacific began to erode. For the Americans, the aftermath was both exhilarating and instructive. Each successful raid provided lessons in coordination, timing, and navigation under extreme conditions. Reports from returning crews were meticulously analyzed, leading to refinements in tactics, improved communication protocols, and better integration with intelligence sources. PT boat operations became a template for asymmetric naval warfare, demonstrating that speed, stealth, and audacity could offset numerical and technological inferiority. The human element, the courage, improvisation, and cohesion of the crews, proved as decisive as any weapon, reinforcing the idea that even the smallest unit, properly employed, could influence the course of a campaign. The losses sustained by Japanese convoys had immediate operational repercussions. Troops arrived late, supplies were delayed, and critical positions were left vulnerable to Allied offensives. The disruption forced Japanese commanders to divert additional destroyers and smaller escort vessels to protect future convoys, stretching resources thin and complicating strategic planning. PT boats, once considered a nuisance, had become a significant threat to the logistical backbone of Japan's Pacific operations. The fragile wooden hulls that Japanese officers had mocked now dictated tactical adjustments and forced a re-evaluation of assumptions about vulnerability and naval dominance. Beyond material losses, the raid sowed a lasting psychological impact. Japanese sailors faced the terror of invisible, unpredictable adversaries. The familiar routines of convoy defense no longer offered comfort. The success of the PT boats challenged not just strategy, but belief in the security of Japan's maritime empire. For American forces, the triumphs reinforced morale and confidence, instilling a sense of control in an otherwise vast and chaotic theater of war. The stage was set for further escalation, with both sides adapting to the lessons learned in firelit nights and shadowed straits. The long-term consequences of the PT boat campaign rippled through the Pacific theater. Japanese naval planners, forced to confront the unexpected efficacy of small, fast craft, began altering convoy procedures, imposing tighter formations, and increasing night watches. Additional destroyers were assigned as escorts, and routes were modified to reduce predictability. Yet no amount of adjustment could fully neutralize the threat of the PT boat's agility and audacity. What had begun as isolated raids evolved into a sustained pressure campaign that continuously forced Japanese commanders to adapt under duress, consuming resources and attention that might otherwise have supported offensive operations. American small craft doctrine gained legitimacy from these operations. The effectiveness of PT boats demonstrated that asymmetrical tactics could yield outsized results. Commanders began to coordinate PT boats with intelligence networks, aircraft, and larger warships, creating an integrated approach that maximized their impact. The lessons extended beyond immediate operational gains. Naval warfare was no longer solely defined by battleship duels or cruiser engagements. Speed, surprise, and human daring had become decisive factors, reshaping planning and engagement strategies for the remainder of the Pacific conflict. Morale shifts were equally significant. American sailors aboard PT boats were emboldened by the tangible results of their courage and skill. Each successful strike reinforced the notion that human initiative could overcome material disadvantage, fostering a sense of purpose and identity within the crews. Conversely, Japanese morale suffered a subtler but insidious blow. Confidence in the infallibility of their naval power eroded, and fear of unseen threats became a persistent psychological burden. Officers had to grapple with the reality that even their most heavily armed convoys could be rendered vulnerable by vessels that, on paper, should have posed no serious danger. The PT boat campaign also influenced broader strategic thinking. The disruption of Japanese supply lines affected operations across the Solomon Islands, indirectly aiding larger American offensives and complicating Japanese planning. The campaign proved that unconventional warfare, when executed with precision and courage, could shape outcomes far beyond the immediate tactical level. From the burning decks of sunk transports to the exhilaration of crews navigating moonlit waters, the PT boats had redefined what was possible in naval warfare. Their legacy endured in doctrine, morale, and the hard-earned lesson that audacity, ingenuity, and determination could challenge even the mightiest fleet. The story of the PT boats is a testament to the paradox of warfare. The smallest, most fragile vessels can sometimes wield the greatest influence. Wooden hulls, dismissed as toys by confident Japanese commanders, became instruments of precision and terror, proving that ingenuity and courage often outweigh sheer size or firepower. The men who manned these boats faced the edge of survival nightly, navigating treacherous waters under the cloak of darkness, relying on instinct, skill, and each other. Their daring strikes disrupted supply lines, shattered assumptions, and left an indelible mark on the Pacific theater. Beyond tactics and strategy, the campaign reveals the human dimension of conflict. Fear, determination, and resilience were as decisive as engines and torpedoes. The psychological impact on both sides reshaped perceptions. For Americans, it reinforced confidence in the value of audacity. For the Japanese, it underscored the peril of underestimating an opponent. In the quiet aftermath of fire-lit nights and burning convoys, a lesson emerged that would echo across future conflicts. Adaptability and courage can turn apparent weakness into strategic advantage. Ultimately, the PT boats transformed more than just the night battles of the Solomons. They reshaped the understanding of naval warfare itself. They proved that even in a war dominated by steel and firepower, human ingenuity, bravery, and the willingness to embrace risk could alter the course of history. What began as a shadowy, uncertain endeavor became a defining chapter in the Pacific, reminding the world that legends often arise where least expected, and that even the humblest craft can leave a mark that endures far beyond the waves. The echoes of these wooden vessels continue to remind us that in war, as in life, courage and creativity often determine outcomes that brute force alone cannot.